Hello, thank you for coming. My name's Darren. We're going to talk about Laravel 5. As Tim said, well, originally we were going to talk about what's new in Laravel 5, but some of this covers some of the kind of basic features. So ended up calling the talk Laravel 5. Wow. So, introduction. It's me. My name's Darren Craig. I'm the CTO and partner in -40. Pretty new. That's my Twitter handle if anybody wants to listen to me talk rubbish. I built my first website back in 1998, which was quite a long time ago. And I did it in Microsoft Word. Like I said, I had like an HTML editor and it was like frame sets and it was horrible. It was hosted on Fortune City. Anybody else sign Fortune City? Yeah, GeoCities? Yeah. GeoCities, yeah. So that's where it was. I've been using PHP for over 10 years. I also moonlight as a superstar DJ sometimes. That's true. So, some caveats. The code in the presentation is just a pure example. It's not best practice, it's not written in sort of a proper way, and it's definitely not consistent, like brackets all over the place, that sort of stuff. The whole talk is a mix of basic and advanced ideas, so hopefully some of you who are not familiar with Laravel will pick some of the basics up, and some of you who are a bit more familiar with it will get familiar with some of the newer stuff. Please ask questions. Stop me at any point if I'm not explaining something correctly or I'm just talking rubbish, then stop me. And there's more than one way to skin a cat, so if I show you how to code in one specific way, it doesn't necessarily work for everyone or everyone's specific project, so I'm just showing you one way to do things. Okay, so let's look at an overview. What is Laravel? I'll go through some of the basics. Well, it's obviously a PHP framework. Version 1 was released only 4 years ago, 2011, and it's developed by a guy called Laravel. You can find there, lovely guy, met him last year. And version 5 was released February this year. So you can see there's actually quite a quick cycle in version changes there, and part of that's down to Taylor working sort of 2 weeks in a month on it full time. He gets to do that in the company, he works for Pace when he can do that because they love him so much and love Laravel so much. And there's also now a couple of conferences that you can go to. So there's one in Amsterdam, which is at the end of August this year, and the US one is somewhere around the start to the middle of August. So why am I talking about it? Well, first of all, I've been using Laravel since version 3, which was probably about 3 years ago, 2 or 3 years ago. I think it's probably the best PHP framework around at the minute. Some of you may disagree, but that's all opinion. We're all striving to make better and more robust applications. The reason you're all here is because you want to learn something. The reason I'm here is because I want to learn something. We're all trying to be better developers and we're all trying to put out better products at the end of the day. And I think Laravel's helping lead that charge. And one of the reasons for that is because, first of all, Taylor's working on it so often that he gets to keep up to date with everything that's going on. So, Laravel 5 is now based on PSF4, the auto-loading standards. It includes contracts and interfaces, which we'll talk a bit about. It also has a command bus, which we're going to talk about as well. It's based completely on solid principles. Does anybody not know what solid is? Everybody good? You know? It's essentially a set of principles that cover things like single responsibility principle, using interfaces to make your code more robust, list cost substitution, but we'll talk a little bit about it as well. In the community, the Laravel community specifically, you'll see people talking a lot about DDD, which is domain-driven design, and we'll talk a little bit about that shortly. Testing, event sourcing, and Laravel, Taylor, and people who work on Laravel kind of listen to these ideas and start to incorporate them in their releases, and there's quite a quick release cycle. Version 5.1 will be out within the next month or two, so everybody will be upgrading again, but there's a few extra new features in that, which is really nice. Under the hood of Laravel, we have, it's all based on Composer. Is anybody not using Composer or doesn't understand what it is? Let me just explain it. Composer is a PHP package manager. Essentially, you use a JSON file and run a command line command to pull in packages from different developers, mostly from GitHub, And that helps you sort of get your application started, and it means that if you want to add a new package or something to help you, then you can just grab it and it just pulls it straight into your application and it's there ready for you to use straight away. Well worth looking at. I think it's definitely the future of PHP. Laravel requires PHP 5.4 and upwards. Any Symfony developers in? Yeah, there's loads of Symfony components under the hood of Laravel. It's, I would say about 50% Symfony components. It has an excellent command line tool called Artisan, which we'll talk a bit about. It has its own ORM, active record ORM, called Eloquent. Yeah. It also has a couple of extra little things which are not really part of Laravel, but come as part of the standard version 5 package. One of those is PHP Spec, which is a testing library. Anybody using it or not using it? Anybody using it? No? I'll show you a little bit about it in a second. It uses a concept called design by specification. The idea is that you take a class that you want to write, and you write tests to specify what that class should do. And I'll give you an example now. But the way you use it is you run a command through the command line to describe a class. So this class that I want to write is going to be a class to represent an email address, a value object. So when you run that command, it creates a file called email address spec in the spec folder. And you write essentially a little method to say what you want the code to do. So my email address class, well, I want it to validate the email. So I write a test, and this is using PHP specs language, and I'm saying this should throw an exception when the class is constructed with that as the email address. Does that make sense so far? If I'm losing anybody, I'm happy to explain it a little bit more. No? Okay. And that's that test. So when I run that, it's going to fail because I don't have an email address class at the minute. But that's my test to check that when I construct the email address with a string, that's a valid email. And we'll write another one. I want it to normalize the email address, so I just want it to lowercase all the characters. So I'm going to construct the class. Sorry, I should explain as well, when you're using PHP spec, when you're using this, it's not referring to the spec, it's referring to the class that you're going to build with that spec. So this should throw an exception, is the email address should throw an exception, not the email address spec. Does that make sense? Same on this line. So this should be constructed with this weird email address. When I'm actually constructing the email address instance, not the class that I'm currently in. When I call the get email method, then I should return the same email address but all lowercase. Now, I can run that using that command, and it's going to say failed, class does not exist. But one thing that's really, really nice about PHP spec is that it'll say, do you want me to create that class for you? So it creates it for you, hit yes, it creates it for you. And if you've already written some specs like this, where it's looking for get email, it'll include that method in your new class for you, so you don't have to worry about it. It's really, really nice. So we'll just build out the email address class very quickly. When I'm constructed with my email, validate it. If it doesn't validate, throw an exception, and I'll show and test it doesn't show the source. Otherwise, set the email and lowercase it all, and then throw in a get email function, and that's it. That should pass in theory. Does that all make sense? Is that all clear enough to everybody? So that's a lovely little aside. PHP spec's great. Have a look into it and see if you can use it for your testing. I wish I could use it more, but we don't have time. Elixir then is another thing that's been included. It's basically a wrapper for Gulp. There was a talk a couple of weeks ago on Gulp. I didn't get a chance to make it, but it essentially just wraps around Gulp and does lots of similar things to Gulp with a few added extras. That's kind of how you use it, which looks very much like Gulp anyway. There's an API that does all sorts of things, but that's a couple of examples there. It's well worth looking into. One of the nice things I really like about it is when it outputs your CSS file, you can use this function here, and the brackets are basically Laravel's templating language. I'm not really covering it, but that's how it works. You call it there, and what it actually does is versions your CSS file for you. So if you update something, push it online, it means that cache is all clear for everybody, it's all sorted, nobody's getting some old version, and new clients are ringing you up going, why is my CSS level fine? Happens all the time. So, one of the major changes in Laravel 5, there's a new directory structure. Just before I go on, who's using Laravel 4 at the minute? Or any version of Laravel? Who's using it just in work constantly? Yeah? There's a few of you anyway. So, there's quite a significant change in the directory structure between Laravel 4 and Laravel 5. I don't know if any of you can see that, it's probably not a good example. But basically, in Laravel 4, in the app folder, there's a whole bunch of folders like config, and database, and languages, models, storage, views, all of this stuff. All of that stuff has been moved out and is now above that. Part of the reason being is that really those things have nothing to do with the core logic of your application. So they're trying to move everything out that's not the core logic of your application and saving the app directory for all of that core logic. There's a whole bunch of new directories now in Laravel 5, which can be a bit confusing at first to look at. That's a scary one. There's no models directory anymore. So it's going to beg the question, where do I put all my models? We'll talk about that in a minute or two. And as I said earlier, all leverages PSR4 overloading, which is awesome. Everything's namespaced now. It never used to be. It's all namespaced. So your app folder is in an app namespace. And if you don't like the app namespace, you can use the artisan command line, and that will change everything in your app folder, all your classes and everything to your new namespace. So you can do it when you start, or you can do it 6 months down the line, or whatever. It does it all for you. It's nice. It's a bit of a clearer version or view of the version 5 structure. So as you can see in the app folder now, there was always a commands folder. There's now a console folder, events, handlers, commands, and events, which we'll get into, HTTP, providers, and services. One thing I'll just point out is that HTTP and console are there to act as entry points to your application. So somebody might come through a website to your application, or use an API, that's your HTTP request. Similarly, you might want to write something based on a command line that somebody can interact with your application. So the console handles that, and in each of those folders, we'll see in a little while, there is a kernel file that kind of bootstraps those two entry points, so you can do things when they're accessing from those points. So there's also service providers directory. Service providers were actually available in Laravel 3, I think, and upwards. They've been around for a while, but they've been moved out into the core of your application, so you actually are forced to make more of them because they're really, really useful, they're really, really good. And they used to bootstrap and configure different classes and things throughout your application. One of the examples actually recently was that, has anybody used the Laravel user used for macros? Yeah, for macros basically are you write functions to output form elements, but you can wrap them in like bootstraps, HTML and stuff like that. So it's just like you run a little like form text field or something, and it will just automatically wrap it in whatever code you decide. So you can do that for any kind of thing. But I wrote a service provider to do mine, so I just stuck them all in there. It's kind of like, where did I put this code? Write a service provider for it, stick it all in there.
Sorry, forms actually out of Laravel 5 or am I talking about something different?
Sorry, say that again?
4 has a forms construct for your planes.
Sorry, yes. Forms, the form library itself, I'll discuss that in a second, but the form library itself has been removed from core. But what I'm talking about, so the form library as it is will, if you write form : text, for example, that'll give you a text field. A form macro goes one step further. You can define, say I guess, form bootstrap text, for example. I can define then that outputs a different type of code. So I'm basically defining form functions, like custom form functions, and then you can then create all the stuff around that. So your templates aren't getting full of the same stuff. And then it also means if you move from bootstrap to foundation, you're actually only changing those macros, and then half your application is sorted. So service providers, yeah, they're stored in app providers. There's an app service provider, which is kind of your main bootstrap one. We'll talk a little bit more about it. Bus service provider we'll also talk about. Config service provider is basically just there to bootstrap configuration files. If you create custom ones or whatever, you can just go reference them in there and they'll get loaded in and pulled in. An event service provider, which we'll also talk about, root service provider. And when you create a new service provider for anything, you have to go into your config app PHP file and include it in the same way you would if you pulled in an external library. It just bootstraps that library as part of your app. So roots, not much has really changed with roots, but I'll go over it for those of you who don't really use Laravel. The roots file has moved into HTTP roots. The reason for that being is that roots only really refer to your HTTP requests. It's people coming through some sort of HTTP method. And that's an example there. They've still got the old traditional Laravel 4 style roots, which is the root with the 2 colons. They've also got this kind of more object-oriented version now, which is the router variable, and that gets bootstrapped in the root service provider, which we'll see in a second. I said everything is namespaced. The roots file has actually been set up that no namespace is necessary. Everything is referenced to controllers when you're talking about your class here. So my / request will go to the welcome controller, but the welcome controller is in app HTTP controllers welcome controller. Anybody confused? No? Good. You can use RESTful routing, which looks like that. So you can actually make get / and post / respond to different methods in a class, which is really, really nice for like forms and stuff. You can just post and save URL and tell it where to go, and it's grand. Put, patch, delete, whatever you want, and you can make it all work. Root variables. So what if I want to pull out a user ID or something? Well, here's an example with a video. So root get video, use the little curly brackets to represent your variable, and I'm going to use the show method on the video controller to handle that. Or if I want to go a bit further, then I can get a specific comment relating to a specific video, and I do it like that. So I just reference it. Nice and expressive, it's plain English, everybody can understand that, so there's no technical debt. I feel like when a developer comes in behind you, it kind of makes sense. It's pretty obvious what that's doing. And that's going to go into a video comments controller show method. So what does our video controller look like? Well, just like that. It automatically resolves the variables that you pass into it. So from the top one, my video ID goes straight in. And similarly, I can do that one in the video comments controller, and it does exactly the same. And then I can work with it. You can also do resource reading, which is really nice. What this does is, it looks like that. Everybody see that there? You can set up a reference to a controller which has all of your essentially RESTful calls. So the resource you would have, you might want to look at all the resources, all the videos, for example. You may want to edit a video, you may want to create a video. Here's what they all refer to. So if you just go video on its own, you get the index in that controller, the index method. If it's video / and some ID, you get the show. Video / create is create, so that's for displaying some sort of form or something so that you can do something. Store is what create posts to, essentially. Edit, so it'll be video / ID / edit, maps to edit, and update is similar to store, and delete does the same sort of thing. So it means you can basically create a controller with all of these methods, and 90% of your CRUD operations are sorted, because that's 90% of what you're doing. And it's just that one line of code. You create a controller with these methods, which you can do from the command line. It'll do it all for you. And that's it, done. You can also use implicit controllers, which look like that. And what that gives you is the ability to create RESTful routes. So get index will respond to a get request to the index of that resource. You can do post to whatever you like, and you can actually create any action in that format, keyword, and then where it goes to. Is that all okay? Yeah? Anybody any questions? Anybody think they're going to use Laravel? So, this is the root service provider. Just to give you an idea of what service providers look like and what they can do. Very, very simple. These get loaded as your application is getting bootstrapped, and you can just provide some code for it to run before anything happens. So this is the standard one in Laravel. I think I've stripped out a few little bits just to kind of tidy it up, but this is the core functionality. It references a namespace, which I said earlier, you don't need to namespace your roots. Well, this is the namespace that comes with it as default, that it's going to reference.
So does this replace the filters? There's a filter PHP used to run. Or is this?
Filters within roots.
So there's a filter PHP that's sat in like the alien function or whatever.
In the what, sorry? I can't hear.
There's a filter PHP and it would run anytime a page loaded.
Oh yes, yes. So filters are still there actually, but there's also another thing called Middleware, which I'm going to cover shortly. But no, this is just basically to load in your roots file. This tells Laravel where your roots are stored. And that's all this really does. So it uses a map function. So Laravel just calls this map function. It creates a group of roots within that namespace, which is the controllers, and all it's doing is requiring the roots file that's there. It's nice and simple. I like personally to separate out my web roots from my API roots from my admin roots, and I can do that there just by creating namespaces for each of them and including different files. So all my admin roots are in one file, all my API roots are in one file, and it just keeps them nice and clean, nice and tidy. So you can extend that any way you want, and that's all you need to do with it. Have I confused anyone with that? No? Please speak up if I have. Root cache is a nice new feature of Laravel 5. Has anybody got a Laravel or any kind of application with a roots file that's like 100 roots long? Or crazy roots, yeah? And is it kind of getting slow?
Yeah.
Yeah? Well, what root cache does, Taylor had noticed this problem as well. So it basically resolves all your roots and just creates I think it's just a JSON file or something with a big list of all your roots in it, and it just loads from there until you reload the cache at some point. It doesn't work with closures, unfortunately. In Laravel, you can use closures in your roots. It doesn't work with those, but if you're using controllers, it works every time. It's very, very nice. So resolves and caches your root files, drastically speeds up your applications. I think it's something like, I mean, it doesn't sound that significant, but you can go from like 500 milliseconds to 50 milliseconds. You know, it's a fairly significant change every time your application is being and it's simple. You just call it from Artisan, and it does it for you. So Eloquent. There's not an awful lot new here, but I'll cover it for the people who don't use Laravel. Eloquent is Laravel's active record ORM. It's beautiful. It's the best ORM on the market by far. It's so, so nice. So if you're not using an ORM, you can just include this in your project. If you don't want to use Laravel, grab Eloquent and stick it in your project. So it's Laravel's own active record implementation. It's really, really expressive. It reads like real English when you're writing it, and that's one of the things that's really, really nice about it. It's really easy to read and understand. Like all ORMs, it's there to make you, or allow you to query and update your database. It's got built-in drivers for all of those databases. Out of the box, there's probably about 1,000 packages for other stuff. So there's Mongo ones and all sorts of different things. I don't know if there's a Neo4j one. Does anybody use Neo4j? Yeah. Have you used Laravel?
No.
Anyway, sorry. There's, yeah, lots of packages available. So what does it look like? Well, when you're defining your model, there's a very simple user model. You extend the model class, and I'm actually defining a comments relationship here. So I'm saying this class, this user has many, and then comment is the name of the class. If it's namespace, you just namespace your reference. And then I can start to actually get some information. So users all, get all the users from the database. It makes sense. Find by an ID. Get users where their name, or get a user where their name equals some variable. And that's getting the first user. So it's not returning a collection, it's just that record. Get all users who are under 18. And that's how you can grab your relationship. So if I want to get the comments associated with that specific user, I just say with comments. Lovely, it just pulls it straight out of the model. And then I can loop through them. The for each thing is Laravel's calculating thing again. That's what it looks like. Does that make sense? Yes?
Is there ever a situation where you find that even with using your loading and stuff like that, it's still generating a lot of statements every time you
SQL?
Yeah.
Even if you're using this technique?
Well, you've got a lot of relationships set up.
Yeah.
And you pull out from different tables.
Yes.
And like if you dump what the queries that's actually generated, it's maybe did like 15 statements in one page.
Yeah.
Whereas if you wrote like raw SQL, you could do
Just
it in
one.
one.
It's the Eloquent N+1 problem.
Yeah.
That's exactly what it is. Yeah. So the first one is exactly what you're talking about there. I'm grabbing the first user and I'm looking through the comments. So Eloquent can use a process called eager loading. If I reference the relationship without loading it in first, it can still pull that relationship back, which is really, really nice and really, really useful. But the problem is in the first example at the top here, that's going to pull each comment out individually. So if there's 1,000 comments, I'm doing 1,000 queries to get all those comments out. To solve that problem, you just use the with statement on whatever relationship you actually want to pull out. And you can comma separate relationships, so I could do comments, comma, I don't know, whatever it is, addresses, phone numbers. And that will only do one query for all of those relationships. So that should solve your...
Yeah, no, I've still got times where, like, I know they're pretty complicated statements and stuff, but maybe load maybe 15 queries in one page, you know,
Yeah.
from that one line essentially. But even with eager loading.
Are you going through other relationships, like
Yeah.
so say comments and stuff? You go like comment,
Yeah, it's like nested with
commenters and stuff
exactly.
like that. Yeah, I mean that's a little bit more complicated to solve. What you can do is on your comments model, for example, you can make sure that it always loads by default with those things loaded.
Okay, yeah.
So it just pulls them out every time you load that. I can't remember where it is in the documentation off the top of my head, but I'll have a look for you.
Do it once.
Yeah. Right, Laravel's IOC container. First time I started looking at the IOC container, I felt a bit like Arnie in Total Recall. Oh. So yeah, I felt a bit like that. I couldn't get it in my head. It was very complicated to understand. And the document, it was like Laravel 3, I think, and the documentation wasn't very good, and people weren't really explaining it very well. So I'm going to attempt to explain it a little bit better, hopefully, and hopefully some of you will understand it. So, who's done some programming like this, where you knew up an instance of a class in every single method in your controller? Come on, we've all been guilty, right? We've all done it. Awful way to work, awful way to work. And then you kind of go, well, I can move all the variables to config files and do it all up and stuff, and that's okay, but then if you actually want to use Twitter instead of Facebook, you have to go through your entire application and change everything to Twitter, and it just becomes a complete pain in the bum. Twitter might not have a get friends method on it, so you have to change all those out as well, and it just becomes a complete nightmare. This is where the IOC container comes in. Well, this is a kind of better example of still doing it fairly badly. Where you do it in the construct and then you can roll out through your whole application, but you're ended up doing it across multiple classes anyway, and the same problem exists. You have to go through everything and change it all up. So yes, IOC container. So you can tell Laravel to provide a fully instantiated class instead of the requested class, and this will make a bit more sense in a second. Let's take a look at the app service provider. So what's happening here is in the register method, we're binding a call to the Facebook class and actually returning a fully instantiated version of that class with any dependencies it might have or whatever. So within my Laravel application, next time I ask for Facebook, a new Facebook, it's going to return the full one with the key and secret and stuff in it. Well, sort of. That's how you would do it if you were just doing it in your constructor or something like that. But Laravel's IOC container likes to make things easy for you. So you can actually just pass it in as a dependency. You don't actually have to do anything to your controller, you just reference it in your constructor. Laravel goes off and goes, right, I know I need that. Let's bring it back. That'll make a little bit more sense in a second, hopefully. So we're going to talk about contracts. Not that type of contracts. Does anybody use contracts in their program day-to-day, or interfaces as they're also known? No? Yes? A couple of people. Brilliant. Basically, they define the public API of your classes. Laravel packages, most of Laravel's features, they have like a mailer and a caching setup, and they have like a password hasher, and lots of different things. They now package these interfaces as part of Laravel 5, so you can reference them in your application. There's one for each of the core services. And what they're useful for, as well as using the IOC container, is they help you decouple your code. In the same way that we weren't really relying on queuing up a new Facebook instance in that previous example, this helps you kind of get away from that as well. So, here's an example. I'm passing in mailgun here because I need to send an email from my controller. But it's tightly coupled. What would actually happen here if we decided that we weren't going to use mailgun anymore and we decided to go to Mandrill or Gmail or even use Facebook Mail? Well, it's alright if my application is quite small and I'm only really doing it in one place, but if I have like an enterprise level application and I'm sending email from everywhere, that's going to cause me huge headaches. So, if we take mail as an example, this is what Laravel's mail contract looks like. So what that's doing is basically saying, if you're using mail or any kind of mail library in this application, these are the methods that need to be available on that class. Yeah? So if I decided to create, first thing you'd do is you would reference the mailer interface. So instead of passing in a dependency like Mailgun's own class, you actually reference the interface. And what that allows you to do is you can write your own implementations of mailers using that interface. So I'm implementing mailer, which is the interface that we just looked at. And if you're using like PHP Storm or something and you implement an interface like that, it'll say you need to have these methods on your class. So it'll create them for you and you can fill them out. So if I'm using Facebook and I'm writing a send method, well, my user controller doesn't really care how it's being sent, it just cares that I'm running a send method, right? So if I run a send method on this, then you can use the Facebook API or whatever to send it and it's all good, but it's still just calling send a level up from that. And in my app service provider again, I can actually bind a call to that contract to a specific implementation of a mailer that I want to use. So now, if I have mail going from 50 classes across my application, and I want to change to Gmail, well then I write a new one of these for Gmail that has these 3 methods on it, and I just change it here. And that's it. My entire application has changed how it sends mail. That's quite confusing. It was for me at first. Have I explained it okay? Does anybody want to ask questions about that?
So your example is for a a mailer function which is within Laravel already?
So Laravel has its own mail implementation, right? It can use, I think it can use Mailgun and a few other things. So each of its implementations, Laravel will have a Mailgun mailer class or something like that. And in there, it will be implementing mailer. It will have these three methods, and then within those methods, who knows what happens? They're just sending mail through that Mailgun mailer class within those methods. Similarly, they'll have a mandrill one. It'll look very similar to that. It'll just implement mailer. It'll have the same method names, and it will be sending mail through mandrill somehow.
Okay. And mailer is just almost an empty or a class with those empty functions, yeah?
Yeah. So that's it. All it is.
So,
That's it. That's it there. So you don't even define the functions in an interface. You define what the function is going to be called and any dependencies.
Yeah.
But that's it. And then it's like a schematic for what your classes should include.
So it's really only something. Is it really only something that you would use for sort of inherent functionality of Laravel?
No.
Or no, you can expand it out to sort of.
No, use it for you. I've started using it for pretty much everything. Well, that's maybe not strictly true, but let's take a database implementation, for example. You can have a database interface, and on that you're going to have. We were looking at things like get, first, to grab records from the database, or find by ID, or find by name, or whatever it is. So I might have an interface for a user repository or user table, or whatever, and I have all these methods defined on it. So I'm using SQL, or MySQL for now, but down the line, I don't know, we may decide to move to Redis or something like that. So if I've defined everything in a contract like this, I can write a class that's called Redis database thing, whatever, which includes all these methods, and then I use my app server just to switch it out. Because all those methods now exist on my new class, I know my application is going to work. So I'm only switching out in one place, and the whole application changes to Redis database.
Okay.
Have I explained that okay?
I think it's the sort of thing that I probably have to do to get my head around.
Yeah. So think about it as like this basically just says, in my application uses these methods to send mail.
Yeah.
It doesn't care how it sends mail or what service it uses. It can be Mandrill, Mailgun, Facebook, Gmail, whatever it is. These are the methods that my application uses to send and work with mail. So I reference that then across my application. I'm actually referencing the contract as opposed to the implementation, which is the Mandrill mail class or Mailgun mail class. And it means that I can write a Facebook mail class that implements those methods. And whenever I want to change it to something else, I can just change it here. And that's one place across the whole application.
Are you able to swap out one time, swap out the implementation between based on consumer pattern?
Say that again?
Are you able to swap out implementation at one time like the straws and pattern?
Yes, well, I mean, there's multiple ways of doing it, but yes, you can. You can just define it, you can use config and all sorts of different things to do it, or whatever. Yeah. So similarly then, if I wanted to swap it out to a Twitter mailer, I'm just swapping it out like that. And my application doesn't actually change at all. Okay. Is everybody clear on that? We can talk about it afterwards if I can explain it better some other time. Right, another new thing. How am I doing for time, by the way?
It's 22.
22, right, I'll rush through because I'm only about halfway through slides. Right, file drivers. There was file drivers anyway in Laravel 4. They basically allow you to take files, manipulate them, dump them somewhere else. Very, very simple to use. It's now powered by the Fly System package, which is very, very nice. One really nice thing about it is it allows you to set up local and remote file systems at the same time, so you can use Amazon, S3, Backspace, there's support for lots of others. They're not packaged as part of the main core, so you need to grab the additional packages if you want to use them. That's what a config file looks like. So you just set up your keys and secrets and all the rest of it. You set up your default, whether you want it to be local or cloud, your default cloud, which is S3 in this case, and then you can reference paths and all the rest of it. It's very simple to use, uses that same sort of expressive syntax that the rest of Laravel uses. You grab which disk instance you want. You can grab which cloud instance that you want. Then you can just see if files exist, or you can store them, get them, put them. It's all very standard sort of commands, but it makes life really, really sweet. Okay, one of the awesome new features of Laravel 5 is method injection. Similar to injecting your dependencies into the constructor, it actually allows you now with the IoT container to do it directly into a method. And it helps cut down on cluttered constructors. If you're only using a certain library and one method in a class, you don't really want to put it in a constructor because you start building up lots of ones that you're only using in one place. So that's how you do it. I'm just injecting the mailer. And in this example, I'm actually injecting it along with a variable from the root. And it just resolves anyway. It just knows that it needs to go. Did that all make sense? Yeah. Okay. Cool. Form requests, another lovely new feature. So, always a problem with validation. Everybody gets validation. So this is what form requests aim to solve, and I really, really like them. I think they're really, really awesome. So validation in version 3 and 4 was a bit verbose. You ended up having lots of methods in your application that kind of looked a bit like that, or sometimes you would abstract the rules to inside the model, and just like lots of different ways of doing it, but it was just a bit kind of messy. I really like really clean methods. Like most of my controller methods now are probably like no more than 2-3 lines at a time. And most of that's because of form requests. So they make things very, very clean. There's an example of a register request. At this stage, my validation's passed. I don't need to do anything else. It's all done. So my method in my controller is actually now just processing whatever information somebody has submitted or whatever it is. It automatically validates and it automatically redirects back with all the errors. So if you post from a form, it hits the form request, says no, sends back where it came from, has all the errors and validation done for you. So you can generate a request using Artisan. Just looks like that. And it's stored in HTTP requests, which is pretty obvious. That's what it looks like. So there's an authorize function on your request, and what you can do is set up some sort of check to see if somebody's logged in, for example, or if they have specific access. Maybe it's just an IP address, something like that, to make sure that they have permission to make that request. The nice thing about this is that request gets blocked before it hits the core of your application. Nothing goes into the controller and then gets validated and looked at and then gets sent back. It all happens before it even gets to that point.
Can I ask you?
Of course.
What would you see if, say, you wanted to create somebody's new username? So I'm picking a new username, but it may already be taken.
Yeah.
And obviously, a classic way is you fill in the form, you press a button, and it goes and thinks about it, and I can see how that works really well.
Yeah.
I guess the new way is Ajax. So I type in something, I move to another field, and it's already away checking. Do you find that Ajax really fits in?
Works perfectly. It works perfectly. So the response, it's been really well thought out. The response actually sends a JSON response if it's an Ajax request. Otherwise, it just redirects. So yes, it works perfectly. Now, I can't remember what error code it is. You get like a 4.2 error or something, and then you get the message package. Sorry?
Override the response.
Yeah, you can always override the response if you want something slightly different. But yes, Ajax works great. Just on your point there, in Laravel there's actually a validation rule called unique. So it's unique, and then comma, and I think it's the table name, so it's like users, and then that's it. Oh, sorry, username, yes, the field name as well. And then you can also specify an ID to ignore. For example, if it's say you're changing, or you're updating a user record and you want to keep that email address, So it's unique for everything except him, if you know what I mean. So yeah, it just makes things really, really clean. The way I tend to work now is I will create new requests for every single action that I'm doing. So if I'm creating a new user, it'll have everything required there. If I'm updating their email address, then I'm only updating their email address. I'm only going to have an email validation within that. It just makes things, for me, it makes things a lot cleaner, and it also starts to map the actual, what my application is supposed to be doing with what my code is doing. It goes back to the concept of DDD that I was talking about at the start, and if we have time again, I'll talk a little bit about that a bit more. But it's a really nice way to work and easy to understand. The form and HTML helpers that we were talking about a little bit earlier works basically the same. It's been removed from Laravel 5, but it is available as a composable package that you can just pull in to your application if you want it. I think one of the reasons that was done, if I remember correctly, was that they wanted to kind of farm that functionality out and see if anybody could make it better or do something with it. Just try it.
So just to go back to the validations of it, the request handlers, is that as opposed to putting the models in?
You don't put it in, you just create those request files.
Okay.
Go back. There. You create those request files, so you just use that for whatever you're trying to carry out, whether it's register user or whatever it is. It creates a file like this, and all you do is you set up your rules within that.
So you never drop it in the model anymore?
No.
Okay.
Never. Well, there's lots of arguments for and against that.
Sure.
I prefer it.
It's just best practice to do it that way now then, or?
Best practices. A deep conversation.
Sort of what they are showing.
Things are starting to move towards this. The reason being is, well, this question, should your model be responsible for validating form input? So going back to the solid principles, the single responsibility principle, I would suggest that a separate class to validate something makes sense. Also, when it comes to writing tests, if you're testing that it validates correctly, you just want to test that one class. You don't want to have your whole model and trying to fight around it and stuff like that. So it just makes things really, really nice and really big. So the form helpers. Cover all that. Yeah. So onto middleware. Middleware is new in Laravel 5, and it looks, kind of works a bit like that. So your core application, everything that kind of sits in that app folder is right in the middle, and the middleware kind of guards it sitting on the outside. Very, very similar to filters, which Laravel 4 has, where you can do lots of different things with it. The difference being is that filters kind of sit in the application area and do stuff once requests come into your application. It then decides what it's going to do with the input and works it all out. Middleware sits way above that. Nothing gets into the core of your application with middleware. It just it protects it. So they're essentially root decorators, if you like. Something happens before it gets to your application and then comes out the other side. So you can have before and after middleware. We'll look at some examples. Filters, by the way, are still available if you want to use them. They're the same as they always were. So all your middleware is stored in a folder because it all relates to your HTTP requests. There's one built-in called Authenticate, which surprisingly makes sure somebody's logged in. Redirect if authenticated. So basically, it goes to a specified page if somebody's already logged into your application and they're trying to access the login page, for example. They also have verify CSRF token. CSRF is built into Laravel, has been for quite a while. They just moved this out into a piece of middleware. Things seem to be really going down this middleware route. It's well worth looking at. But it's very, very easy to add your own. So you just create a command. Where I'm using all these commands, by the way, there's nothing wrong with just like copying and pasting the file and changing it about. That's all good. It still works. Make middleware. I'm going to create one here to whitelist some IPs to access them. So that's what I've written. Don't know if it works. We'll test it. But you get the idea. The handle method has to be there. That's what Laravel is looking for when it's executing your middleware. You should really use an interface for it. I've got just a whitelist of IP address. If it's not in the IP address list, then redirect, and then go on to your next request, because you might have lots of middleware requests to get through. Laravel just queues them all for you, goes through them. And if you want to do something after instead of before, then that's how you do it. Really, really simple. When you create middleware, you need to register it in your application to let Laravel know that it exists. So there's a kernel file in your HTTP folder. Looks a bit crazy, but all you're really doing is setting up a couple of arrays of files, just referencing them. So the top one is middleware that is run all the time. Every single request that comes into your application, those files get checked and executed. I've put whitelisted IP in both just as an example, but those are for those. These ones at the bottom are ones that you can include on specific routes, so that you might only want to protect a certain part of your application or have something apply to only a certain part of your application. That's the bottom ones. So you just give it a name to reference it by and then tell it where it is. And that's how it looks in your routes. So if I want to protect my entire admin area with whitelisted IPs, I can do that. Or I can do it within controllers, whatever you like. Who hates Chrome? Yeah, everyone. I know. You end up with a big Chrome file, you have to go to the server, and you end up with all of this stuff. It just looks awful. Get to that job. It's just horrible, isn't it? It's just awful. Right, so Laravel, hopefully, will come up with the solution for all of this. The first thing you need to do with their new scheduler is still put a cron job into your cron file somewhere. It just references an artisan task, and that's all you need to do. Then in your console kernel, which is similar to your HTTP one, it's only for console requests. Do this quite quickly. There's a schedule method, which passes in a schedule class. And that's how you write your schedule commands in your application. So you can do it hourly, every 5 minutes, whenever you want. You can also run command line tasks. Update those every day if you really want to. You do weekdays, there's a whole range of them. They're all in the docs, I'm not going to go over them all now, but that's how you do it. You can also send output via email or to certain formats. It's really, really nice, really, really simple.
So you could call a controller and a function in the control from the schedule?
Yes, yeah, you can do that, or you can create, Laravel, I haven't covered it here actually, but you can create commands. So you can actually create artisan extensions if you like, and then they just do whatever you want, and your whole application's bootstrapped before they run, and it all works. Right, it's my favorite bit of Laravel. Command bus, or Laravel 5 should I say. I actually started using one in Laravel 4, there's a couple of packages that run them, and it's completely changed the way I write code. Sorry about that. So what a command bus does is help separate the logic of your application into small manageable actions. Creates reusable classes that can be used from different access points like console, HTTP throughout your application. It also helps keep your code really, really dry by doing that. And helps make it testable. We were talking a minute ago about separating those out. This kind of all applies to that. So how does it work? Well, a request comes into your application from somewhere. For that request, there's a corresponding command, which gets piped into the command bus and gets dispatched to a handler. Okay? Well, this should make sense in a minute. So, what's a command? Well, a command is a data transfer object or a message. It's a class. Which contains only the information required for carrying out a specific action. The bus matches the command to the corresponding handler and then executes the command. And the handler is responsible for carrying out the task in response to that command. Anybody feel like that? Yeah? Some of the best acting I've ever seen. Here's some examples. You might have a request post to user register. My command is just called register user, and my corresponding handler is called register user handler. So in Laravel, it's kind of looking for that convention where the command is called something, and the handler just has handler tacked onto the end of the name. Same here, might be updating password. So I'm posting the update password, I have an update user password command, and there's a corresponding handler. So that's how I make a command, very, very simple. And then it goes into app commands, register user, and that's what mine looks like. So it's empty to begin with, and you just fill it out. So when I'm registering a user, what do I need? Well, I need a name, I need an email address, and I need a password. That's what I want for that task. Yeah? So how do I dispatch that to the command bus? Well, in my controller, I've got a dispatches command trait. That trait is actually in the parent controller, so I just put it in for illustration purposes. All of your controllers have access to dispatch commands. And then all I'm doing is running this dispatch and passing in a new class of that registered user class that we just looked at, and filling in the details that just come through from the form or wherever it might be. Or if you are a bit lazy and you're pretty sure that your request is going to match your class pretty well, then you can pass it in like that, and it will automatically map your properties to your command. Is everybody okay so far? I know this is a bit mental. So create a handler to handle that command, and it looks fairly similar. You pass in the instance of the register user command, well, it gets passed in automatically, should I say. Then you can create your user, and what's your uncle, that task is carried out. You can take on it. Is that clear enough? Clear as mud? Everybody's nodding, but I'm not so sure. Okay. Similarly, we'll just do one quickly for update password. Same idea, I want the user ID and I want a password. Create a handler for that. Oh, just not far. Right. So same idea, just going to update password. I'm actually calling an update password method on the model, but you can do it whatever way suits you. You can also queue commands. Anybody use like Beanstalk or you can just implement should be queued contract. Everything gets added to your queue. Laravel has like lots of drivers for different types of queues, like Beanstalk and stuff built in. I don't use them that much, so I can't tell you an awful lot about them, but if you want to, that's how you use it. And that takes me on to events, which are kind of tied into commands. Think about when you're talking to a client and you're discussing how you want something to happen in the project. So if we just use register user as a very primitive example. Well, you're talking to the client says to you, when a user registers, I want them to receive an email confirmation. Well, you can approach that in a couple of ways. You can just do it all in your controller, register the user out, send the email, all the rest of it. It's not very nice that if you need to come back and refactor it, or you're doing it in all places. But what you're really doing with the client there is discussing a consequence of an action. So as a consequence of the user registering, they're sending an email. And that's where events come in. Events kind of handle your consequences. It's also known as the publish subscribe pattern. So it's used to model the concerns of the application you're building. They work in a similar way to commands. So examples are always easiest. Let's generate an event. My event in this case is user was registered. That's what's happening. So we've gone through the process of registering the user. We're going to launch user was registered event. And it looks like that. Very similar. What you're doing is passing in an instance of that user model into that event. And all that is, again, it's a bit like the command at the start. It's just a data transfer object. It's just a class to kind of hold the information you need to make that event work. And you can generate the handler for it in the same way. Sorry, I'm rushing over this, I'm just over time. So I'm going to have a handler called send registration confirmation. So it's just a class. It looks like that. Your event gets passed in, and then I can send mail. And because I passed in a user to that event class, I can actually access the user's name, email address, whatever I want, generate the email from that. It all gets fired out. And you register them in your event service provider. So there's an array called listen. That's what Laravel's listening for. So when a user was registered, what do I want to do? Well, I want to send a registration confirmation. But I might also want to do, say I'm working in a business and I'm actually using a system internally. I might also want to generate some holiday entitlement, so that goes into a different table somewhere or do something else. That's a consequence of somebody being a new employee. Or I might want to set server permissions. Or notify all the current employees that somebody's going to come and join the team. So it's just some primitive examples, but they're very useful. And how do you fire them then? Well, once I've registered my user, I just fire off a new user was registered. Just like that. We're nearly there, I promise. That's pretty much it. That's pretty much the core of what we're going to talk about. Is like, does anybody have any questions on that bit? No? Just bored you to tears. Laravel has a bunch of optional packages. We already kind of talked about a few of them. Here's another one. It's called Socialite. It's really, really nice. Provides consistent interface for authentication using social networks. It's like just the same code. You can use Twitter, GitHub, Facebook, whatever. It's really nice. Returns a consistent user object and API as well, so you can run get name, get email, get avatar, and it just works. And you can just pull it in like that. They also have another really nice one called Cashier. Documents for all this, by the way, are on the Laravel website. Similar, provides a fluid interface for Stripe. Handles creating and modifying subscriptions, recurring charges, free trials, free payments, invoicing, lots and lots of different stuff. You know Stripe can do. Stripe is awesome. It's really, really nice. Cashier does it all and does it all without having to write all the usual rubbish. Where can you learn more? Laravel Docs, obviously. Laracast. Anybody got a Laracast account? Yeah, great, isn't it? Yeah, it's awesome. Check it out. Pay, it's like £9 a month. It's not bad. Check Twitter out. Laravel PHP is the official account. They retweet some stuff now and again. Anybody use IRC? It's old school, but yeah, people still use it. Well, there's a couple of really active channels on there. Laravel is really active. I'm finding layering around some of these. Dev Discussions is a pretty new one. It was set up by some of the guys who are heavily involved in Laravel. Or like it a lot. And that's us. Any questions? No? Yes?
There's an assets folder in Laravel 5.
There is. There is an assets folder. Yes, I didn't cover any of the front end stuff. So I wonder if I'll go back to the folder structure. So there's actually a, the assets folder is missing from this example, but there's a resources folder, and inside that there's an assets folder, a views folder, and a views folder. The assets folder contains basically, that's where you want to put your JavaScript and your CSS, if you're using Sass and stuff like that, but only put it there if you're combining it with Elixir, which was the Gulp build tool, because it needs to be copied into a public directory. So they kind of combine, but it's really, really useful for if you're using Sass or something. You just put it all in there, sort it all out, and then it gets built and put into your public directory.
So if you put something like CK editor and then you simply copy it from there.
Yes, because you set up your assets in the assets folder. Any of the plugins and stuff that you include, you can use your build tool to pull out the parts of those assets that you need, and maybe you want to create one JavaScript file out of all of them. So they put them all together and then just copies that into your public folder. So that's how it works. If you have a look at Elixir, it kind of makes a bit more sense. In fact, I'll have a quick step. So in this example, using the mix functions here, it's actually referencing that assets folder. It's looking in that assets folder. The second one down here is taking these two files and combining them, and then outputting it into one single file in the public directory. And that's how it works. Anyone else? Yep.
Do you find there's much difference trying to do DDD with Laravel 5? I mean, it's a bit more oriented than when it's...
Yeah, well, the models directory has gone, which is a big change. It really is trying to encourage you as a developer. I mean, put the models directory back in if you want, if that's the way you want to work. Here, nobody's going to shout at you if that's the way you want to work. It's just trying to make you think about things in a slightly different way. So the way I would tend to work now is I would think about DDD, domain, think about the business that I'm working on. So for example, there might be a careers department within a business. The careers department don't really care very much about the billing department. They're two separate things. So if I'm building something, I would think, right, all my billing stuff is going to go together. So in my app directory, I'll just create a folder called billing. And I'll create a file called invoice, or I'll create a file called client, or whatever it is. Those are my models as such. And you build everything around that, and then you create another one and keep everything together. So using the command bus and stuff is really, really useful for that sort of things, because between the two, where there is the odd bit of crossover, you can fire events and detect it in one domain, in one folder, and apply those changes, or you can detect it somewhere else. And it's a really useful way to work, but still blowing my mind. I'm no expert by any stretch of the imagination. Anyone else?
In terms of the encryption, is still using Eloquent?
It is? I think so, yes. Yeah, I'm pretty sure it is. Yeah. Who's going to use Laravel tomorrow? Who's going to try it?
Continue to use.
Yeah. I mean, I've barely scratched the surface and I rushed through things there, but it's a very, very nice framework, and hopefully you'll get something out of it. So thank you very much.